your midst on this gray Sunday morning. Some sunshine came already through. Welcome you from my children's playroom. As you can see, there are some rather charming pictures behind me. I'm surrounded by Lego blocks and little plastic creatures and doll furniture and doll houses and what seems to be some kind of octopus pet. So it's a good context for preaching about these texts, I think. The charming background, of course, doesn't distract or deny that we're still in a moment of crisis. When we thought the numbers were bad in March, when we thought the political and social structures in this world were lamentable and sad, in the spring, I think the last weeks have taught us afresh that things can get worse. And I think as humans, just by the very fact that we're humans, we have questions that come in those situations. What are we supposed to make of this? How are we supposed to live in this? And those are human questions, and everybody has those. Whatever faith, whatever background, whatever language, whatever nation you're from, everybody is asking in a moment of crisis, how are we supposed to live in this? But there's a different set of questions that Christians bring to this situation. See, as Christians, and this is a problem that runs from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians all the way to a present day. The main reason Paul writes to the Thessalonians is to remind them that the suffering that they're facing is not just sad or a surprise, but it's actually what they're destined to experience. He says it in exactly those words. Don't you know that you're called to suffer? See, as Christians, we don't just look at the world as humans. We're looking at the world through the cross. We're looking at the cross and we're saying that, as strange as that might be, we're saying that in the greatest moment of suffering, that's where life happens. We're looking at the greatest defeat and we're saying that's where a victory is. We're looking at suffering, we're looking at crisis, and we say, this is where we become who we are. This is where transformation happens. So as we look at the crisis of pandemic and at the crisis in our own life, it's a very different question. We look at the suffering and we say, who then are we in this pandemic? And where is our hope? And how are we supposed to live in the pandemic as Christians? Those are very different questions. And of course, our first place to go to find answers to these questions is our beloved Bible, which is a good instinct, but also difficult, of course, because Jesus is not talking from a context of pandemic. Nowhere in the Bible is there pandemic. The closest you get to is maybe the famines or leprosy in individual situations, but there's no pandemic in the Bible. And actually, a lot of the questions that are so important to us today, be that end-of-life questions, stem cell research, homosexuality, a lot of these questions are not addressed or only in very, very few details and places in the Bible. And so finding answers in the Bible is actually a little bit more complicated. And Joseph and I are spending a lot of our time and our life together with our colleagues and so many others in this country to keep thinking about this. But the Bible is actually a wonderful place to find answers to this. And the main reasons for this is that I think what this pandemic can do for us is to reintroduce us to the Bible and to show us what the Bible actually is. The Bible is a book about crisis. The Bible is a book of survival literature. See, all the way from Genesis, which is, of course, has its roots so far, far back, but finally comes to the paper when the Israelites are in exile, when they're sitting in Babylon and they're faced with other gods who apparently have triumphed over them, when they're faced with kings who are cruel. And Genesis 1 says, no, it's our God who's in charge. And actually, every human being bears the image of God, not just the king. Genesis 1 is about creation, yes, but it is also a text of resistance, a text of survival, a text of saying we all matter to God. Fast forward a few chapters and you're sitting with Abraham, who constantly struggles with the nations around it. Fast forward and you're with Israel in Egypt, suffering under slavery and hardship and death. Fast forward again, and you're in the land, and Israel is in constant struggle with the nations around. Fast forward, and you have the Philistines coming in, you have Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, these massive empires, just one after the other, walking over the Israelite people. You have Ezra and Nehemiah trying to rebuild with little resources and a doubtful community. You turn into the New Testament, and the people that Jesus talks to in Matthew 25, the text we read earlier, is a very, very young movement called the Christians, the followers of Jesus, who are faced with opposition from, of course, the Jewish faith, with which they're kind of trying to figure out how do we belong together? How does this work with the Romans, with the destroyed temple? Fast forward, you're with Paul, you're with the writer of Hebrews, or you're in Revelation. And Revelation is all about overcoming the circumstances. So do you see what you're holding in your hand and what you're reading? It's a book of minority. It's not a book of the winners. It's a book of minorities who are constantly oppressed, who are constantly suffering. And the Bible as a whole, not just in little details here and there, is a text of survival in a world that comes undone. So yes, go to the Bible for answers. This morning, of course, we want to see how Psalm 90 and Matthew 25 give their own answer to this situation. And as many of you know, the Psalms are actually not just 150 little poems, but they're 5 books. And each of these books has kind of its own tone. And book number 3, Psalms 73 to 89, are the Psalms where Israel laments exile. In these texts, we read about a broken temple. We hear about questions. How long, O Lord? Why? Where are you? And it's then no surprise that Psalm 90, the first psalm of book 4, stands kind of as an answer to this. It's looking back at exile, at this terrible reality that Zephaniah and the other prophets describe in so much detail. And so we're going to sit with Moses for a while this morning and see, how does Moses, who wrote Psalm 90, answer those questions of suffering, of survival that the 15 Psalms before pose? And then we'll turn briefly to Jesus in Matthew 25. And as I just mentioned, it's a text about things far, far away, yes, but it's also a text that speaks right to the first Christians and says, what are we supposed to do in this situation of oppression with what's given to us? And so as we turn to Moses, and as we turn to Jesus, and as we hear those two men speak, we will hear that they both give one answer. It's very, very interesting how they both go about it. Both give one answer. And the first answer that they both give to how we should live in crisis is, I have to admit this, maybe more so my natural response, and maybe more of my life than I want to admit over the last months has actually lived out that kind of answer. And so they both give you this answer, but then they turn around and they say, there is actually a second answer that we want to give that is more important and that needs to be heard louder. So let's jump right in, starting with Moses in Psalm 90. Over the last weeks and months, I think one thing has become very, very uncertain, and I'm afraid we'll have to stretch it into the promise of Christmas and what Christmas will look like. The future is very, very uncertain. I've booked and rebooked and canceled and elsewhere booked and then rebooked flights 4, 5, 6 times since May, trying to get to my family in Germany. And it's just not going to happen. I rebooked them again for January, but who knows? The future is deeply, deeply uncertain. And as so many have done over the last months, natural impulse, of course, is to go backwards, yeah? To look in the past and see what can the past teach us about the present, and how can that help us deal with the future? And what better place is there for the Israelites to go back to Moses, that man whom we've met over the last weeks, wrestling with God in Exodus, leading the Israelites out, the man Moses who has so much experience with God, and so many difficult situations. And in many ways, we've gone back to earlier pandemics in the life of the church. And Joseph, of course, as our expert on the history of the church and the struggles that the church has gone through, has much to say and much to offer when it comes to that. But here's Moses. And Moses takes us right back. He doesn't talk about suffering, but he starts somewhere quite different. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. That's brilliant. You see what he just did? In one sentence. You read Psalm 73 to 89, and we're saying, why can we not meet together? Just like us today, friends. Why can we not get together in our buildings? Of course, a very different situation for Israel. Yeah, we haven't been attacked by another army. This is not a situation of war. This is not a situation of persecution. It's a pandemic. Very different. And yet, we can say the same words. Lord, where are you? How long? What happened to our building and our place together? And Moses comes around and he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. This is where the people of God meet, in the presence of God, not in a building. This is where the people of God meet over Zoom. This is where they meet over the phone. This is where they meet one-on-one in the park. Our buildings, friends. And Moses is very, very aware of that. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. And so he starts off with a reality check, and he takes us back, focusing on God. You have been our dwelling place. Before the mountains came forth, you were there. Through all time, you're the everlasting God. Moses focuses us back on God, but verses 1 and 2 are also a little bit of a setup to what follows afterwards. See, we're very quick to talk about the greatness of God. We're very quick about praising how vast and eternal and all-knowing God is. But we're very slow to go the next step that Psalm 90 takes us to. We're very slow to consider then, of course, how small and how short-lived and how somehow insignificant that makes us as humans. You return man to dust, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past. The people are like grass that is renewed in the morning. This phrase often shows up for wicked people as a way of comfort. Yeah, the wicked are like grass. They oppress you today, but they will be gone tomorrow. But Psalm 90 takes that same image and says, you know what? Everybody is like that. Friends, I'm only entering this phase, and many of you are already there, where you find the people around you that you grew up starting to slowly die away. I'm entering this phase slowly, and it's not just the people around us, but it's the people that were in the spotlight. Sean Connery passed away, friends. There's so many other people who were just part of our world, if we want to or not, and they're not there anymore. And my children will never know who Sean Connery is, and other people who have passed away over the years. We're just not here very, very long. And the more we focus on God's greatness, the more that really sinks in. And Moses is saying, hey, this is my response to your suffering. You're meeting in God, not in a building, not in a place, but you're also human beings. And this is what happens to human beings. For all of those of you who have kids, or for those who work with young people, this is even more reality. Every couple of months I look at my kids and I think 5 years went by. It's a very painful reminder just how quick things go. If you're a student, same thing happens. All of a sudden your degree is done. If you're a mother at home, the years fly because there's so much to do. The years fly. Psalm 90 makes this a bit more difficult yet, because apparently the writer, and the lectionary jumps over this a little bit, sees that some of this movement of time has to do with God's anger. Verses 7 and 8, for we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. Of course, we need to hear that in its Old Testament context, where Israelite sort of had a contract with God. We read about that in Exodus a couple of weeks ago as well, saying, "You're our God, we're your people. You do some stuff, we do some stuff. Let's sign this." Yeah, literally with blood in Exodus 24. So there are certain responsibilities that the Israelites had towards God, and certain expectations of blessing and of judgment that would come from them. And as Christians, of course, we say, yes, that's a good covenant to have, but we have a co-signer, Jesus Christ, who on the cross with his own blood undersigned that covenant and bore the wrath of God. We're not sitting around and lamenting that God has judged us with a pandemic. We're not sitting around and saying God's wrath is on us so heavily. But at the same time, friends, we can't jump over this too quickly. Verse 8, you have set our iniquities before you. I once joined a student team of the student council, kind of student government stuff, and we didn't know each other. And the first thing we did was just to go out and just kind of get to know each other. And somebody had the foolish idea of, as way of introduction, to sit together and everybody would say the worst thing that they have ever done. A really bad way to get to know people. I don't know what idea that was. And of course, we were all making funny jokes. I think I said something like, there was a phase in my life where I willingly and happily listened to Phil Collins. Or things like that, right? You wouldn't tell them the worst thing you've ever done, but just imagine you would. Just imagine we would have all stood up one after the other. Just imagine we would all unmute now one after the other and say the worst thing that we think we have ever done. Please let's not do that. Can you imagine what that would be like and what that would feel like? You have set our iniquities before you. All those things are before God. And Moses goes further and he says, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Friends, there are so many sins that I'm terribly aware of, but then there is probably twice as many that I'm not aware of. The things that I said that hurt people, the things that I didn't say when I should have said them, the things that I've done and the repercussions of them every time I use my credit card, and what happens because of that in some way on the other end of the world. Every time I buy something in the supermarket that is in plastic and I don't ask or care to ask where it comes from, I'm just happy about the price. Friends, all our sins and all our secret sins are sitting before God. It's not comfortable to talk about the anger of God, but do we want to have a God who's complacent about evil? Do we want to have a God who says, well, I'll just close my eye to this? Or do we want to have a God who actually responds to this, not just to our evil, but also to the evil done to us and to so many others? There is a real sense in which God looks at us in the ways we do, and it hurts him, it grieves him, makes him upset. And yes, we are forgiven in the cross, but we can't jump over these texts too quickly, friends. The Zephaniah passage is horrible. And of course, Zephaniah is trying to make a point here, to move his hearers to return to God and to turn around. And yet the main theme in this text is complacency. He's saying, I'm talking about you, about the people who sit and who say, God is not doing good, God is not doing evil, everything just happens. That is atheism. That is not faith. And so the words of Zephaniah and Moses, they're still true and they're still important for us to hear. Where does Moses end then? Friends, we're human, and the years just fly by. Friends, we're human, and we sin, if we want to or not, and if we see it or not. So verse 12, this is where Moses ends. Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. How do you hear those words? Is that a good thing? Is the conclusion, and this is Moses' first answer, how are we supposed to live in crisis? How is Israel supposed to live in crisis of Psalm 73 to 89? Consider your days and get a heart of wisdom. Are we just supposed to say, okay, let's make the most of every day? let's see what we can learn from this. I think this would be my first impulse. And this is what I said when I said Moses' first answer is a very natural one. It's like, yes, Moses, I think you're right. I think I'm a human being. And I think that there's something that I do before God that is not okay. That my life in many ways is not okay before God. Is this your first? Are you happy with this answer? Well, I'm not. And I appreciate the lectionary so much, the work that goes into this. But friends, if you want to read the Psalms, never ever read parts of a psalm. Read every psalm in its whole. You need to read the whole thing, especially in Psalm 90. Psalm 90, and we didn't read those verses, so I read them for you. Psalm 90 gives you the first answer to crisis in verse 12, but then Moses turns from this very, very plain and easy to agree to theology, he turns to something quite different in verses 13 to 17. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your love. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor, the sweetness, the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Establish the work of our hands. Do you see what Moses does here? He gives you perfect, clear theology, and then in the next moment he turns around and disagrees with it. He says, yes, my life is short and life is difficult. I agree with this, but that can't be all there is. You gotta turn this around, God. Turn around. Give us joy. Satisfy us. Establish the work of your hands. There's not a single other poem in the Old Testament that I can think of that repeats the same words twice in a row. Hebrew poetry writers don't do that. They like to have variation in there. Psalm 90 is the only text I know that ends with the same line twice. Establish the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. Moses is crying out. He's saying, no, there's a protest, there's a complaint. You gotta turn this around. This is not a good way to live. There's gotta be more than just living like grass, making the best of today. There's gotta be more. Turn it around, Lord. This is a word of authority of the man who was on the mountain and wrestled with God. This is a word of authority because it comes from Moses, who, even when God wants to torch the people, he says, no, 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 no. That's not who you are. You're a God who cares and loves. You're grace. You're compassionate. Matthew 25 gives us also, it's actually a very straightforward text. Many of the parables of Jesus are a bit complicated. This one, I think, I don't actually have too many questions on this. And Joseph, I think, already pulled the most important bits out of it. This is not a text for investment, yeah? I can already see this in some, how should I live with my money book? That's not what it is about. It's a text about knowing God. All the servants give and invest their money and work with it in a certain way. But the one servant in verse 24, he says, I just took the one thing you gave me and I put it in the ground so I can just give it right back to you because I know that you were kind of a terrible person. You were a terrible master. Is this your first response in crisis? To take what you have and to put it under the pillow and just leave it there? Is this my first response in crisis? To put my hand up and just say, I just have to make it through this. The most important thing is my safety. So let's hit the pause button on everything I do and just keep my head down. There's Netflix. I can order food. Let's just go through this. I think Jesus just, once again, just hits the nail on the head here so well. It's for so many of the, and friends, there are of course reasons why we do this. There's been disappointments, there's uncertainties, there's been things that have gone wrong in our life. And we all have good reasons to play the safe card sometimes. But Jesus here says, you know what? Serving me is better than safety. Trust is better than putting everything you have aside. Where I work, I have the privilege of seeing all these young people come in. And there are students who signed up for a 3-year degree in theology, in the midst of a pandemic, who have that faith and foresight and self-abandon. And of course, there's something in your 20s that's a little bit easier than in your 30s and 40s. I get that. But there they are. They start a degree in social work, in Bible, in the midst of a pandemic and an uncertain future. It's those kind of people about which this text talks. So are you supposed to start a non-profit organization? Are you supposed to plant a new church somewhere? Maybe. But don't overread too quickly what we saw today already. Some children dance, some children sing. Some people are really good with technology. Some people show up every Sunday and read texts. And some people are just faithful. God has given each one to their ability. This text does not call everybody, it does not shame everybody into saying you have to save the world now, or God will not be happy with you. Each to their ability. The servant who gets reprimanded actually also get reprimanded not for investing the money himself, but to bring it to the bankers. Important detail. Bring it to the bankers. If you can start things, at least find somebody who can and support them. Yeah, bring it to the bankers according to their ability. What is given to you today? Is there a family member or neighbor you can think of who's lonely? Just pick up the phone. Don't write another email. Pick up the phone. Remember that when we used to have conversations on the phone? Yeah, where you hear a voice of somebody else? It's quite an amazing thing. It doesn't happen that often anymore, I fear. Call somebody. Sit down for 20 minutes and write a card. That is your ability. That's the one that we all have. And then there are others besides. So let's wrap this up. Let's come to an end. Jesus and Moses. Friends, we're in a crisis and we have questions. And we just touched at the... let's talk about Lamentations. Let's talk about Jeremiah. Let's talk about Isaiah. Let's talk about Exodus. Let's talk about Galatians. Let's talk about the Gospel of John. Let's talk about Jude and Peter and Revelation. The Bible is not shy to bring these things to our attention. The Bible is not afraid of telling us that the life of faith is full of questions and of crisis. Go read your Bible. It's everywhere. Everywhere. Not just in the book of Job. It's everywhere. There's an honesty about life in the Bible. And there's an honesty about what Jesus and Moses have to tell us about it. They're both very, very aware, as good pastors, as good counselors, as good wise men, as good prophets should be. They're very aware of our first natural instincts, namely with Moses, to resign ourselves to a theology that's very grim and pessimistic. They're very aware of our natural inclination to just hold on to the little that we have. But both give a better answer. If you're suffering, if you've lost people, you can complain about that to God. Establish the work of our hands. Work this out. Turn this around. If you're unsure about starting something new, Matthew 25 calls us today to dare and to try. To live a courageous life. And not because of what we have or what we can or what we can develop. Because our hope is in God. In the God who is a dwelling place. In the God who's been there before the mountains were brought forth. And of course, as Matthew 25 holds before us, in the God who will reward at the end of our day such faith. A God who's not afraid of people who complain, and a God who's very, very powerful to get behind every little thing according to our ability that we produce today. So go back, read Psalm 90, all of it, and hear Jesus' words to us today. This is the word of the Lord.